Good morning, and today we shall be discussing a very important topic. It's practically, I believe, the most important topic that we shall be discussing during this course. We are at the beginning of the 4th century, okay? Therefore, a century which brought with it many, many changes for the church. And most of these changes were kind of centered around a particular historical figure who was not even a Christian. He was Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, who brought with him many different, many decisions, which brought many different situations for the church. Some were very good, others were very, very bad. Now, the most important thing that Constantine probably did, hoping to help the church, was to organize a Council of Nicaea. Okay, so today we shall be discussing what led to this council, also giving a very important historical context of the changes that were brought about by Constantine, and eventually we shall see what happened after the council. As you will realize, the next lectures, especially the lectures till, let's say, the Christmas holidays, will be practically all related to this council, even though years pass and decades, we shall see that at least for 55 years, the council will still be, in a way or another, causing consequences. Okay, and probably the most important consequence to the Council of Nicaea was actually another ecumenical council, the Council of Constantinople, which took place in the year 381 under Theodosius. But we shall come to that, and then we shall see how, up till Constantinople, Nicaea was still creating, let's say, situations, okay? Because they were not always good, but they were not always bad either. So I have mentioned Constantine. So obviously our first topic today will be what actually Constantine did. Who was Constantine and how did his decisions affect the church in such a way? So from what you know from your courses on church history, you probably know that the last great persecution was the one created by Diocletian in the years 303 and from 303 till 305. Now, after this persecution, Constantius and Galerius were two emperors. Okay, remember that Diocletian had divided the empire into two parts, and each part had an Augustus and a Caesar. Okay, so it had the emperor and, let's say, the co-emperor. Now, Constantius and Galerius were actually two of these. Okay, and towards the end of his life, Galerius issued an edict of tolerance in favor of the Christians. Okay, so Galerius was the one who decided that the empire should tolerate Christians. When Constantius died, his son Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his loyal legions. Okay, Constantine was the son of Saint Helena, whom we mentioned in our last lecture when we discussed a bit Eustathius of Antioch. So, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the legions, and this is a very important thing, okay? In many cases, or at least usually, it was either the emperor who chose his successor, or else the Senate. Now, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the legions, not by his father, even though probably his father was not against the idea, and not even by the Senate of Rome, okay? So obviously, Constantine's, let's say, title was questioned by many, especially by the person who was next in line to become emperor after Constantius. So, rule over the western part of the empire would come down to civil war between Constantine and Maxentius. Maxentius, who was the son of Maximian. Now, Maximian was the emperor of the West. The Augustus of the West. Remember, Constantius was the Caesar of the West. So practically, the one who should have become emperor was actually Maxentius. Okay, so Maxentius waged war on Constantine because Maxentius saw him as a usurper. Now, their legions met at the Tiber River, where there was the Milvian Bridge on the north boundary of the city of Rome in the year 312. Now, there are many versions of the story of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, And the basic tradition includes a dream or a vision which Constantine had, okay? Presumably, Constantine saw a Christian symbol emblazoned in the sky, okay, on the eve of the war. Now, the symbol was probably the labarum. Okay, now what is the labarum? The labarum is a monogram of Christ consisting of the first two Greek letters of the name Christos. Okay, therefore it was the key, which looks like an X, and the rho, which looks like a P. Okay, many times in churches we see this symbol, a P and an X crossed upon each other, and many times these represent martyrdom, okay? But actually they are the first two letters of the name of Christ, Christos, okay? Many people call it the Pax, and many people call it the PX, but actually it is a key and a rho, okay? Not a Pax and not a PX. Now, there are some scholars who believe that this symbol is what Constantine actually saw. Now, upon seeing this symbol, Constantine heard also a voice from heaven saying "En tuto nika" in Greek, okay, which means in this sign you will conquer. Okay, many times you might have heard this saying in Latin, "In hoc signo vinces," okay, which is the same words which are found in the motto of Birkirkara, if I'm not mistaken. In this sign you will be victorious. In this sign you will conquer. In hoc signo vinces. Okay, now vinces is in the future. Okay, so this sign will make you victorious. So it's like this voice from heaven was saying something which will happen in the future. Okay. Now, what did Constantine do? Now, Constantine was already familiar with Christianity. Okay, his mother was a Christian, and his father, Constantius, was very tolerant towards the Christians. I mean, he never accepted persecutions in the areas where he ruled. Okay, so Constantine was a friend of the Christians. So what he did was that he ordered his men to put the sign that he saw in the sky on their standards. And he and his legions marched into battle under the banner of Christ. Okay, so the first decisive thing that Constantine did was actually showing in public that he was asking the protection of the God of the Christians during this very important battle, okay, the battle between him and Maxentius, which would define who would be the emperor of the West. Constantine defeated Maxentius, okay, probably because Maxentius was very, very rash in his battle, okay? He was a very good soldier, he was a very good commander, but he was so convinced that he would win that he was very, let's say, he did not think things properly, okay? And he did many stupid mistakes in this battle. And therefore, this war between Constantine and Maxentius went down into history as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which happened on the 28th of October of the year 312. Maxentius actually was one of the people who drowned in the Tiber. Okay, now one of the stupid things that Maxentius did was that he crossed the bridge rather than waiting for Constantine to cross the bridge himself. So he crossed the bridge, and when Constantine started kind of gaining ground, all the soldiers together rushed over the bridge in order to go to the other side of the river. The bridge was very old, and it practically collapsed with all the soldiers on it, including Maxentius, and many drowned. Okay, those who were not drowned were either forced to claim their allegiance to Constantine, or else they were very kindly murdered. Okay, so that was the way things were done in Rome. So, therefore, Constantine entered the city of Rome as a liberator. Okay, now why as a liberator? Because it seems that some people were against Maxentius himself. Okay, it seems that Maxentius was proven to be very harsh. There are some people who also claim that he was a usurper, actually, and therefore Constantine was the one who saved the city from this person. The next year, I believe in March, 313, Constantine and his co-regent Licinius, who was the emperor in the east, issued the Edict of Milan. And this edict legalized Christianity. Okay, so what is the difference between what Galerius did and what Constantine did? Galerius issued an edict of tolerance. Okay, being a Christian is no longer illegal. But Constantine made Christianity a recognized religion. Okay, therefore that is a very important step forward. Okay, whereas till the time of Constantine, only let's say the religion of the ancient faith of the Romans was considered as the only legal religion in the empire, apart from Judaism for historical reasons. From now on, Christianity was recognized as a legal religion as well. Although it would only be enforced in the West at first, this is generally seen as the beginning of the Christian empire. Okay, so we can say that Rome became Christian thanks to Constantine, thanks to this particular edict. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. But you know, all this rain this morning, I got wet and maybe I will be getting cold. Anyway, it is important to note, however, that the Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the only legal religion of the empire. Okay, that would happen in the year 380 with Theodosius. Officially, this edict, the Edict of Milan of 313, simply meant to put an end to persecutions, okay, because now this religion is no longer illegal. In fact, the edict itself was really a letter to the senators granting freedom of worship to all religions in the empire except one particular religion, which was Manichaeism. In this edict, Constantine specified that church property was to be returned at no cost to the Christians. Now, during persecutions, this was one of the first things that used to be done, okay? All the property of Christians used to be confiscated. And after persecutions, usually people had to gain possession of their confiscated lands by paying. And Constantine said, no, these have to be returned without expecting any payment. Thus, the church would officially become a legal entity with also the right to own property under its own name and also receive inheritances. Now, till now, all this was practically illegal, okay? Because if the church was not recognized, it would not have property. People could not leave their things to the church. They could leave their properties or their wealth to, let's say, the bishop of the city, and then the bishop could use it as he wanted, building churches, doing charitable work, etc. Now, from now on, the church as an institution was a legal entity. Imperial money was also eventually used to build churches, okay? And this is how we see that Constantine started favoring the Christians. He started paying from the empire's, not his own, from the empire's money to build churches. And some of the most important churches in Christianity were actually built by Constantine. Okay, I can only mention a few. There is the Cathedral of Rome, which is St. John Lateran. It was built by Constantine. The first church on the tomb of St. Peter at the Vatican was built by Constantine. The first church on the tomb of St. Paul was built by Constantine, and also many important churches in the East, okay, like the Church of the Nativity, the Church of Calvary, and there was also some others. I think there was some other one in the Holy Land, but I cannot remember which one it was. But anyways, just to give you an idea of how much money now was being spent by the empire to favor the Christians. The edict also exempted clergy and their dependents. Remember that the clergy had families back then. So the clergy and their dependents were exempted from taxes. And it also gave bishops the right to use the imperial transportation system. So if a bishop wanted to go from one place to another, he could use the imperial transport system without paying any money. Constantine was also eventually end the custom of crucifixion as a form of execution. And he would also make Sunday a day of rest from work, and he would further exempt Christian clergy from civic duties, like, for example, having to go to war. Now, he began to use some Christian symbolism also on his coins. but he did not discontinue the use of pagan symbols. Okay, so we can say that Constantine was actually a syncretist. Okay, he did not abandon the pagan religion. As we said, he became a Christian only at the end of his life. He was not a Christian during his lifetime, but he started very openly favoring Christians. Now, when Constantine became emperor, he found that the church was in some ways as divided as the empire. In the West, the Donatist controversy was threatening to split the church. Okay, now what was the Donatist controversy? The Donatist controversy was actually something which started in Africa during the persecutions because people who denied their faith were not, there were a group of bishops who did not want to accept them back, and therefore they created the Church of the Perfect, Church of the Saints. Okay, we mentioned something of this when we were speaking about Cyprian. So practically, the Donatist controversy in the West was threatening to split the church, especially in North Africa. In the year 314, therefore a year after the Edict of Milan, Constantine convened a council at Arles. Now, this council was a regional council. It was not an ecumenical council. An ecumenical council is a council wherein all the bishops of the world are invited. A regional council is one which concerns only the bishops of a particular region. So, around Arles, the bishops were invited for this regional council, which was convened by Constantine. Now, this is important, this council, because it was the first council of the church which was convened by an emperor. Okay, but as I said, it was not an ecumenical council. It was not a worldwide council, but just a regional council. In this, Donatism was condemned. Okay, it also condemned the issue of rebaptism, because there was this custom of rebaptizing people who would have denied their faith. Therefore, anyone who practiced or who supported this practice, the practice of rebaptism, was not only considered as a schismatic, but also as a heretic, okay, because suddenly they were doing something which went directly against official church teaching. The Council of Arles also gave bishops the same authority as civil magistrates. Okay, so they could also decide disputes between Christians. Now, this is just to show you how much importance and how much power Constantine was giving to Christian bishops. Constantine himself would treat bishops as his imperial advisors, although he also expected them to return the favor and to consult him on ecclesiastical matters. And this is where problems started. Okay, Constantine expected to have a tit-for-tat relationship with the church. And unfortunately, there were many bishops who agreed with this. Now, obviously, when you have a legal institution and, let's say, a divine institution, they cannot go to bed together. Okay, because if they go to bed together as Constantine expected and as many bishops did, it will only create problems. Because how can you draw a line where the bishop's authority ended and where the emperor's authority started, and vice versa? Constantine would eventually go to battle against his co-regent, against Licinius, and he would become the sole ruler of the whole empire. And this happened in the year 324. So from 324 onwards, Constantine was the only emperor in all of the Roman Empire. Therefore, the idea of having two sections of the empire, the East and the West, with Constantine, it stopped. Okay, even though it then was developed again, but for the time being, it no longer existed. There was only one empire with one emperor. So, how did Constantine interpret this victory which he had against Licinius? He said that the God of the Christians who had helped him become the emperor of the West was now helping him and choosing him to be the emperor of the whole empire. Okay, therefore, God ordained him to become powerful. Okay, so Constantine saw himself as God's vessel. But as soon as he took power in the East, therefore in 324, he realized that he had an even bigger problem than the Donatist controversy. Okay, so in the West, there was Donatism, and he kind of condemned it in the year 314. In the East, he found Arianism. Okay, the Arian controversy, in fact, had erupted a couple of years earlier, and this would lead Constantine to convene the first ecumenical, therefore worldwide international council, okay, the Council of Nicaea, which he convened in the year 325. Constantine had hoped that the church would help him unify the empire, but first he had to safeguard the unity of the church, okay, because Arianism was literally causing chaos in the church, as we shall see today and also in the upcoming lectures. Now, Constantine would eventually move the imperial capital out of Rome. The Senate was too powerful and also too conservative in Rome, and many members of the Senate were still pagans. Remember, paganism was not illegal, okay? Therefore, in Rome, Constantine could not make any significant moves towards having a Christian empire because he would always be opposed by his advisors. So what did Constantine do? He built a new Rome. Okay. Once again, according to him, or rather according to legend, he was told by God in a dream. Remember that even the other time he saw a vision. Okay, now some versions say that this vision was actually a dream. But anyway, this time God tells him in a dream to move the capital city to Byzantium. Okay, which he renamed obviously Constantinople. It was a very frequent tradition, a very popular and common tradition among founders to name cities for themselves. Okay, so Constantine created Constantinople. Now, why did he choose Byzantium? Byzantium was first and foremost, let's say, halfway between Rome and the other end of the empire. And secondly, it was very easily defensible because Byzantium is found in a very closed sea. Okay, therefore, it was very easy to control anything that came into the harbor, which was called the Golden Horn, into Byzantium. And behind Byzantium, there were many mountains. So it was difficult also for any invaders to come in from the side of the mountains. So Constantinople was, let's say, a very ideal spot to have the new capital of the city, of the empire, sorry. Many times, Constantinople was at first called Nova Roma, okay, therefore the new Rome. The project was begun in the year 326, and the new city was consecrated to the Virgin Mary as a Christian city in the year 330. So as you can see, this city was built in a very, very short time. Okay, therefore Constantine was feeling a very big urgency to move out of Rome. One important factor in the move from Rome to Constantinople was that the absence of the emperor in Rome left a void that would eventually be filled by the Bishop of Rome himself. Okay, so the fact that Constantine left Rome helped the Patriarchate of Rome to become the papacy, you can say, okay, because the role of the emperor was taken over by the bishop. And that was when we can say the bishop started having more international authority. Okay, that is when you can say the Bishop of Rome became truly the Pope, okay, from the 4th century onwards. This power vacuum would open the way, as we said, for the Bishop of Rome to become the most important and the most powerful man in the city of Rome, and would contribute to the evolution of the office of the papacy. Over the centuries, the Bishop of Rome would take over some of the programs which were once run by the government. Now, some decades after Constantine, Rome would fall, okay? So after the fall of Rome, it was up to the Bishop of Rome to take care of everything, okay? Even literally the most physical things that were necessary to run a city, okay? And that is when literally the role of the Pope started to become so recognized. And the Pope had also to take care of feeding the poor and also to protect city from invaders. So the role of the emperor was practically taken over by the Pope. The people would come to trust in the Bishop of Rome more than the government for their own security. Remember, after Constantine, there was a period of barbaric invasions. Okay, there were barbarians who were slowly eating away the Western Empire, and the Pope was the only person who was able to, in some way, protect and conserve the city and the people. Now, moving back to Constantine, many scholars have debated the issue of Constantine's faith. It must be pointed out that much of what is credited to or blamed on Constantine did not actually happen until the reign of the Emperor Theodosius, who was emperor from 379 to 395. Constantine never ruled as a baptized Christian. Like many men of his time, he postponed baptism until the end of his life, in part so that he would not be held to the moral standards of the church and the limit of one post-baptismal sin. Okay, so it was convenient for the emperor not to be a Christian. Okay, because if you are a Christian, you're expected to live as a Christian. Okay, you couldn't, for example, order people to be persecuted and killed. You cannot kill your own wife. You couldn't kill your own son. Okay, these are all things which Constantine did. Okay, so it was convenient for him not to be a Christian. Apart from that, as we had occasion to see maybe even in other courses, after baptism, people could confess their sins only once in their life. Okay, now that would have caused a very big problem for Constantine because, as we can say, Constantine was not exactly a saint. Okay, so he postponed his baptism till the end of his life. Also, as I said earlier, Constantine did not make Christianity the only legal religion of the empire. Okay, paganism was not outlawed until the year 380 by Theodosius. Thus, Constantine did not invent the connection of church and state. In reality, of course, Constantine did a lot to favor the Christians, okay, and he also gave Christian clergy many privileges, and he also financed the church. However, all he was doing was changing which religion would be the one favored by the state, while ostensibly allowing freedom of worship for other religions. Okay, so as we said, church and state together were not mixed by Constantine. Okay, Constantine was preparing the way. That's true, yes. But when the church literally became the state, that was in 380 with Theodosius. Okay, but Constantine did his best to prepare the way and to start creating problems in that direction. As to his own personal faith, the question usually boils down to whether he was a sincere believer or simply an opportunist who tried to use the church to his own political advantage. It seems clear that Constantine's mother, Helena, was a Christian, and his father, as I told you, was at least sympathetic towards the Christians. His father refused to persecute the church wherever he ruled. Now, despite this, it is not altogether certain whether Constantine grew up believing in the faith of his mother, or whether he had a conversion experience on the eve of that battle which we have mentioned, okay, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Either way, it seemed clear that he reigned as one who believed in Jesus Christ, who believed that the Father of Christ was the God responsible for his rise to power, and as a person who feared that God could take away the empire from him at any time if he proved unworthy. Okay, so Constantine might have been sincerely a believer in God, but not baptized. Nevertheless, Constantine ruled with an iron hand, and he did not hesitate to murder his political enemies, even when they were members of his own family. Okay, like, as I said, his son and his wife. He looked to the Old Testament more than the New, to guide him in ruling the empire, okay? Because the Old Testament is full of kings who took revenge on their enemies. The New Testament is full of teaching about love, okay? So it is easier to follow the Old Testament than the New Testament. Also, Constantine did not hesitate to use the church to his advantage, especially in an attempt to keep the empire unified, okay? But let's say that Constantine always had not his own personal perks in the first place. He always looked for the unification of the empire, okay? Therefore, whenever he used and abused of the church was in order to have a more unified empire, okay? I think we should say that in his favor. Okay, so enough about Constantine, just to give you an idea of the context in which the Council of Nicaea took place, okay? Now, let's move to the Arian controversy. And the first two important people that we shall mention are Arius, of course, who is the founder of the Arian controversy, and Alexander, who was the bishop of Alexandria. Arius, who lived around the year 250 to about the year 336, was a priest of Alexandria under the authority of its bishop, therefore under the authority of Alexander. Bishop Alexander was teaching the doctrine of the eternal generation of the Son, following mainly the theories of origin. Now, what do we mean when we say the eternal generation of the Son? We had mentioned something about this when we did earlier theologians who spoke about subordination, namely the theology of the Logos. Now, the eternal generation of the Son practically means that the Son had been generated from the Father from the beginning. Okay, therefore, there was no moment when the Son did not exist. Okay, the Son, I mean Leben, not the Son, Shemsh. Okay, so the Son was generated or conceived from the Father from the beginning of time. Okay, therefore the Father and the Son were co-eternal. There was no moment in time when the Son did not exist. That is the eternal generation of the Son. And Origen was one who explained it most clearly. Okay? Now, Arius, however, concepts such as the eternal generation of the Son or the co-substantiality of the Son, meaning that the Son and the Father have the same substance, have the same nature, according to Arius, these seem to overemphasize the connection and the equality of the Father and the Son. And to him, these doctrines seem to be either a form of modalism, okay? Because if you say that the Father and the Son are equal, that the Father and the Son are totally connected, it's like saying that there is one person who sometimes looks like the Father, sometimes looks like the Son, okay? Like a person with two faces. So Arius saw this idea of co-substantiality and eternal generation as modalism, okay? Or else, he saw it as the other extreme, okay? A form of detheism, okay? Now, detheism means believing in two gods, okay? Because if you say that there are two entities, you insist that they are two, they are equal, they are co-substantial, therefore you have two gods, okay? That is how Arius understood all this. Now, according to him, this compromised monotheism because it implies that there are two gods. Okay, so he saw the doctrine of the Logos, let's say, in the two ways as it should not be seen. First and foremost, he saw it as modalism, and the doctrine of the Logos was always opposed to modalism. And secondly, he saw it as detheism. Okay, and always the theology of the Logos insisted that the Father and the Son are of one nature. They are not two, but one. So Arius, we can say, was, let's say, intellectually challenged. But his intellectual shortcomings caused a lot of problems. Now, we have to keep in mind that Arius had studied under Lucian of Antioch. Now, when in our lecture on the Antiochenes, I mentioned Lucian. I told you Lucian was in a very uncomfortable situation because Lucian was a student of Paul of Samosata, who was a heretic. And Lucian was the teacher of Arius, who was also a heretic. Okay, so Lucian was like Christ between two thieves, you can say. Now, Lucian seems, as we have seen in our last lecture, Lucian seems to have followed Origen. Therefore, he believed in the theology of the Logos, and he seems to have explained it quite correctly. But Arius, for some reason, seems to have been more inclined to the ideas of Paul of Samosata. Now, Paul of Samosata was an adoptionist, okay? Paul of Samosata believed that God is one and that he adopted a human being and put his spirit in this human being, and therefore this human being could be called the Son of God. Okay, therefore was an adoptionist. So, Arius seems to have followed more this trait. He reasoned that such an equality of the Father and the Son, therefore the equality of nature, which the theology of the Logos and the eternal generation of the Son insisted upon, according to him, this would make them no longer father and son, but it would make them like brothers, since there was no time when the father was alone, but he always had the son with him. Now, Arius' argument is logical, okay? Because if we think of a father and the son, in our mind, we would understand that at some point, the father must have been alone and then the son came along, okay? But obviously with God, logic does not work as we understand it, okay? But Arius made the mistake, let's say, of trying to understand God using human concepts, okay? So for him, the idea of having a father and a son who were always together, therefore the father was always a father and the son was always a son, for him it made no sense. If they have been together always, then they were brothers, not father and son. Arius, therefore, rejected this theory by going to the opposite extreme and teaching a modified form of adoptionism. Remember, Paul of Samosata, at least from what we can understand, believed that the Father put his spirit in a human being, and this human being then could be called the Son of God. Arius emphasized the distinction between the Father and the Son to the point where the Son was not considered divine by nature, but was a created being who acquired divinity. Okay? Therefore, for him, the Son was created as a God. Okay? Therefore, the Father was alone, and at some point he created a divine Son. Therefore, for Arius, there was a time when the Son did not exist, therefore the Son is not eternal, and the Son has a created divinity. Therefore, his divinity is not the same as that of the Father. That is basically, let's say, the foundational argument of Arius. Okay? The Son was created out of nothing, therefore he is not eternal, and the Son has a created divinity. Therefore, it is not the same divinity as that of the Father, because the Father has, let's say, a natural divinity, a divinity which is in himself, not created. So these are the two basic, most important points that you need to understand about Arius' theories, okay? I will repeat them once again. The Son was created out of nothing, therefore he is not eternal. And the Son created divinity, therefore he does not have the same nature as the Father. Okay, these are the two most important points. So, because of the Church's universal acceptance of what we read in the first verse of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, remember in Greek, word is logos. Okay, and logos, at logos estin sun theos, et logos estin theos. It's something like this in Greek. Anyway, so since the church accepted this as truth, Arius could not completely deny the pre-existence of Christ. Okay? So he admitted that the Logos was pre-existent, but not eternally pre-existent. Okay? So what are we saying here? Practically, we're saying that according to Arius, if the Bible says that the Word was in the beginning, okay, and then later on we read that the Word created the world, the universe, etc., and therefore he could not deny that the Word, the Logos, therefore the Son, must have existed before the beginning of time. Okay, but he was not eternally pre-existent. Only God the Father was there forever. Okay, therefore the Son must have been created at some point between the beginning, which is unknown, and the moment of creation. So the Son must have started to exist at some point in that unknown period. Okay, so we are seeing how the theory of Arius was trying to make sense, trying to keep within the limits of orthodoxy, but at the same time, moving away from orthodoxy. Okay, the Son is not co-eternal with the Father, but he did exist before the beginning of time. Now, following Paul of Samosata, he proposed that the Logos was not the same person as Jesus before the incarnation, but simply the personified wisdom of God, a created manifestation of God, of what God had in his mind, and this was extended to the purpose of creating the universe. So, I had a short glitch, apologies. So, as we're saying, according to Arius, the Logos was actually a created manifestation of God's mind with the purpose of creating the world. Okay, so at some point, God created the Logos, and the qualities that this Logos had in it were his plans to create the world. According to Arius, then, the Logos was not eternal, but was created just before the rest of creation. Therefore, before the beginning of time, so saying that he is eternal, in inverted commas, is somehow fitting, because he is created outside time, but it is not literal. Okay, so for Arius, he accepted in some way that the Logos was eternal, as long as that meant that he was created before the rest of the world. Okay, but if one meant that the Logos is eternal, that is, it was with God from the very beginning, Arius denied that. Divine foreknowledge of the perfect obedience of the man Jesus led God to prepare the Logos to unite with the human soul of Jesus at his baptism, elevating the man Jesus to a level of quasi-divinity, higher than the rest of humanity, but still lower to God. Okay, so this is how the union between the Logos and the human being Jesus took place. Okay, God knew from before, because God knows everything, that this man who would be born from Mary would be a perfect, let's say, person who would obey God. And therefore, God decided that this Logos, this created wisdom of his, would eventually be linked to the soul of this man. Okay, so it is not that the Logos became man, as orthodoxy states, but rather the Logos was united to the soul of a human being. And this human being was elevated to superhuman status. Okay, and this union happened at the moment of baptism in the Jordan, according to Arius. Thus, Jesus Christ, the human being, was an adopted son of God for Arius, just as we might call ourselves adopted sons and daughters of God. But Jesus was not seen as the unique natural Son of God, united with the Father by a shared existence and a shared substance, as the mainstream bishops taught. Okay, so this is where Arius disagreed with the other bishops. Everyone agreed that we could all call ourselves adopted children of God. Okay, while Christ, according to others, was the natural Son of God. According to Arius, Christ was the Son of God as much as we are children of God. Okay, the only difference between us and Christ is that Christ has inside him, united to his soul, this divine wisdom, which gave him more powers than other human beings. Okay, so this is the point of disagreement. For Arius, one might call Jesus the Son of God after his baptism, but one should not call him the Son of God in an eternal or a divine or a natural sense. Now, both Arius and Alexander would agree that Christ was the mediator between God and humanity. For Arius, however, Christ was a mediator because he was between God and humanity, while for Alexander and also for the rest of the mainstream church, Christ is the mediator because he is both divine and human. Okay, so these are the different ideas between Arius and Orthodox Christianity, in this case represented by Alexander. Okay, Arius and Alexander confronted each other around the year 319. Arius accused his bishop of teaching modalism or deism. Alexander in turn accused his priest of dishonoring Christ by demoting him from a divine being to a created being. Arius, at first the issue seemed to be concentrated around the title of Father given to God. Alexander argued that if there was a time when the Son did not exist, then there was a time when God was not a father. Okay, obviously, my father was not a father before he had me. Okay, and that is how Alexander answered back. If the Son did not exist since the beginning, the Father was not a father from the beginning. Now, this implication is very dangerous, okay, because it implies that if God changes from not being a father to being a father, we are saying that God is not immutable. Now, one of the characteristics of divinity in Christianity has always been that God cannot change. Why? Because if God can change, it means that he can become evil. Okay? So this was the danger that Alexander was very appropriately seeing. If we claim that God can change from not being a father to being a father, it means that potentially he can change from being good to being evil. Now, for Arius, God was only potentially a father before he created the Son. Okay, so God had the ability to become a father. That was what Arius was saying. That when we say potentially, okay, he has the power, the ability to become something in the future. While Arius was also concerned to preserve the immutability of God, he believed that the greater threat to divine immutability would be to ascribe a divine nature to one who was born as a baby. He grew up and learned things, and who eventually died. Okay, so Arius' problem was practically with accepting Christ as a fully divine being. Because a fully divine being cannot be born, he cannot learn things like other human beings, and he cannot die. Thus, Arius drew a line between createdness, therefore being created, and mutability between the Father and the Son. Whereas Catholics drew that line between the divine and the human nature of Christ. Okay, now one other thing that Arius seems to not have fully grasped was the idea that Christ had two natures. Okay, now Christ had a divine nature that could not change. And he had a human nature which was created and which could change, like the human nature of every one of us. Okay? Now that is the part that Arius could not understand. For him, therefore, the difference between being mutable or created was something which was found between the Father and the Son, not in the Son between his two natures. Okay, so immutability and uncreatedness belong to the Father, whereas createdness and mutability belong to the Son. That is how he reasoned things. The main differences between Arius, representing the 4th century extremely developed version of adoptionism, and Alexander, represented what would be clarified as the orthodox point of view, can be expressed as follows. For Arius, Jesus, as the only begotten Son of God, means that he is God's favored and adopted son because of his perfect obedience. But ultimately, Jesus Christ was a created human being like the rest of us. The connection between Father and Son is one of cooperating wills, according to Arius. Okay, while the distinction between the Father and the Son is a difference in substance, an ontological subordination in which any divinity that the Son is granted is not his own. Okay, so these are the two things, how Arius explained the relation between the Father and the Son. The Son and the Son and the Father are connected because they have the same will. Okay, the Son always obeys the Father. However, they are distinct, not simply as two persons, as orthodoxy states, but they are distinct also in nature and in divinity. Okay, they do not have the same nature and they do not have the same divinity because the Father has an innate divinity, a divinity which is his own, but the Son has a divinity which was given to him by the Father. For Alexander and for mainstream bishops, on the other hand, Christ, as only begotten, means that he is uniquely and eternally generated. Okay, so being the only begotten Son of God for Alexander and the others meant that he is the only Son of God. God does not have any other Son like Christ, and he was the Son from the beginning. He was therefore eternally generated. Obviously, Christ's existence is dependent on that of the Father. Yes, Alexander and the others agrees on it. You cannot have the Son without having the Father, of course. But they also insist that there was no time when the Son did not exist in reality as a distinct divine being. Okay, so the Son existed since ever as a distinct person who has the same divinity as the Father. The Father and the Son are of the same divine substance, according to Alexander, and the divinity of the Son belongs to him, just as the divinity of the Father belongs to the Father. Okay? It is not an acquired divinity. It is not a divinity which was bestowed upon him through adoption. He is the Son of God by nature, says Alexander, and while we may become adopted sons and daughters of God by identification with the natural Son of God, Jesus Christ remains unique among humanity. Okay, so yes, we can become the children of God as well, but we can become the children of God through Christ, who is the only natural Son of God. The connection between Christ and the Father is therefore an ontological equality. Therefore, an equality in nature and not a connection by the will, as Arius insisted. Okay, so these are the most important points of the whole issue. Besides, both sides knew that the human will of Jesus was submissive to the divine will, as we see in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22. Okay, chapter 22 of the Gospel of Luke is the scene of Jesus in the Garden of Olives. Okay, when Jesus is praying to the Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Okay, so everyone agreed that the human will of Jesus, who wanted to escape death, was submissive to the will of God, who wanted him to go to his passion. Now, for the Arians, this submission of will constituted the only real unity between the Father and the Son. Remember, for Arius and his followers, the connection between the Father and the Son is a cooperation of the wills, meaning that the will of Christ will always obey the will of the Father. So, for them, this submission constituted the only real connection between the Father and the Son, in that the human will of Jesus conformed to the will of God. But the Christology that would eventually be dogmatized in Nicaea, therefore, looking forward to the year 325, and after that will be dogmatized in Nicaea and afterwards, affirmed that this submission of will demonstrated the distinction between the Father and the Son, since it showed that the Father and the Son are not one and the same person, even though they are a unity of substance. Okay, so this is just to show you how the same biblical passage can be used by two opposing parts. For Arius, the submission of the Son means that the Son is connected to the Father, and he always obeys. For Alexander and the others, the submission of the wills shows that there are two different wills. And if you have two different wills, you have two different persons or two different entities. Okay? Therefore, to summarize the Arian Christology, we can say that it is a Christology of ascent, therefore a Christology which goes up. All right? Why do we say this? We say this because in this type of Christology, Jesus Christ is a man, a normal human being, who becomes a God, setting an example of behavior and also implying a salvation by will and also by works. Okay, so Jesus was perfect because through his behavior and through his actions and through his continuous submission to the will of the Father, he was saved, and he can grant salvation to others as long as they behave like him. Orthodox Christianity, on the other hand, is a Christianity of descent, therefore a Christology which goes from up towards what is lower. Okay, why? Because in it, Jesus Christ is the divine Logos, therefore he is divine, he becomes a human being, and he saves by divine intervention. Okay, Christ does not save us because we follow his example. He saves us because he has the power to save. It is another difference between Arianism and Orthodoxy. Okay, so let's stop here for now. And in the next video, I will start then discussing the Council of Nicaea.